Picture this: St. Petersburg, December 19th, 1916. Dawn is breaking over the Neva River, turning the ice a pale, sickly grey. The temperature is 20 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe. A police officer is walking along the Petrovsky Bridge, his boots crunching through fresh snow. He's making his routine patrol, expecting nothing more interesting than frostbite and the distant rumble of artillery from the Eastern Front, where Russian boys are dying by the thousands. But then he sees something. There, beneath the bridge, where the current has kept a section of the river from freezing completely. Something dark against the ice, something that shouldn't be there. He calls for help. Within an hour, a crowd has gathered. Ropes are lowered. Men climb down carefully, testing the ice with every step, because breaking through into that water means death in minutes. They reach the object, pull it free from where it's caught against the ice. It's a body, a man, frozen solid, his clothes heavy with ice. His face is turned upward, eyes open, staring at the winter sky. His beard is thick with frost. His hands are raised, as if he'd been clawing at something when death finally took him. But here's what makes the crowd gasp. Here's what sends whispers rippling through the assembled police officers and curious onlookers. This isn't just any body. They recognize him immediately. Everyone in St. Petersburg would recognize that face, even frozen and battered as it is. Grigori Rasputin, the holy man, the peasant mystic who whispered in the Empress's ear, the most hated man in Russia. And he's been shot multiple times, once in the side, once in the back, once in the head. His skull is fractured, probably from being beaten with something heavy. His wrists show rope burns, suggesting he'd been bound. But here's the thing that will spawn a legend that lasts for over a century. Here's the detail that will transform a murder into a myth. When they perform the autopsy later that day, they find water in his lungs, which means that despite being poisoned, shot 3 times, and beaten with a metal rod, Grigori Rasputin was still alive when he went into the Neva River. He drowned. The man they called the Mad Monk, the Holy Devil, the Dark One, he survived everything they did to him, only to die by freezing and drowning in the darkness beneath the ice. Some said it was proof he'd been protected by God. Others said it proved he was the devil himself, too evil to die easily. The truth, as always, is more complicated and more disturbing, because the real horror of Rasputin's story isn't how hard he was to kill. It's how a semi-literate peasant from the edge of nowhere gained absolute power over an empire. How his prophecies came true with terrifying accuracy. How his death, far from saving Russia, sealed its doom exactly as he'd predicted. This is the story of a man who claimed to wrestle with the devil inside his own mind. A healer who may have actually possessed inexplicable powers. A holy man who preached that the only path to God ran through sin. A prophet whose final vision, written just weeks before his murder, foretold the exact destruction of the dynasty he served. Was he a mystic, a charlatan, a madman, a genius? The answer might be all of them at once. Before we descend into the shadows of Rasputin's story, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered and examined, please take a moment to like this video, and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue illuminating the darkest corners of the past. Tonight, we journey from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, from a peasant boy with visions to a holy fool with the ear of empresses, from miraculous healings to sexual rituals, from prophecies of doom to a murder that wouldn't take, from a frozen body in a river to a curse that destroyed an empire. This is the story of Grigori Rasputin, the peasant who became a prophet, the healer who couldn't be killed, the man who saw Russia's future and tried desperately to prevent it. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Pokrovskoye, Siberia, January 10th, 1869. If you want to understand Rasputin, you have to understand where he came from. And Pokrovskoye wasn't just remote. It was a place where the normal rules of civilization barely applied. Imagine this, a village of maybe 200 people scattered along the banks of the Tura River. The nearest real city is Tobolsk, over 60 miles away through forests thick enough to get lost in and freeze to death before anyone finds your body. In summer, the mosquitoes are so thick they can drive horses mad. In winter, the temperature drops to 40 below zero and the sun barely climbs above the horizon. Darkness reigns for most of the day. This is where the Russian Empire sent its outcasts, religious heretics, political prisoners, anyone deemed too dangerous or too strange for proper Russian society. They were dumped here, in this vast emptiness, and left to survive or die as fate decided. The village itself was a collection of log houses with earthen floors. Most families kept their livestock in the same building they lived in. Cows, goats, chickens, all sharing the same space for warmth during the brutal winters. The smell must have been overwhelming. Sweat, animal dung, smoke from fires that burned constantly, trying to keep the cold at bay. There was one church, Orthodox of course, but its influence was weak. Out here, Christianity mixed freely with older beliefs, pagan beliefs, magic, superstition. The forest spirits were as real to the villagers as Christ and the saints, maybe more real, because you could feel them in the darkness between the trees. The villagers believed in holy fools, urodivi, they called them in Russian. People touched by God, given visions and prophecies, but cursed to be forever outside normal society. Mad, but divinely mad. And they believed in healers in the evil eye, in curses that could kill your livestock or ruin your harvest, in the power of certain people to see the future or speak with the dead into this world. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born. His father, Yefim, was a farmer, not a serf. Serfdom had been abolished just 8 years earlier, but not exactly free either. He worked land that barely produced enough to feed his family. He drank. He beat his children. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man. Grigori's mother, Anna, was more interesting. Deeply religious, prone to visions, convinced that spirits walked the earth. She would later say that she knew from the moment of his birth that her son was different, special, touched by something beyond this world. The family name, Rasputin, was prophetic in its own right. It comes from the Russian word Rasputia, meaning crossroads, a place between places where decisions are made, where paths diverge. Or, in another interpretation, it comes from Rasputny, meaning dissolute or debauched. Both would prove accurate. As a child, Grigori was plagued by visions. He would stop in the middle of working in the fields and stare at nothing, his eyes unfocused, his body rigid. When he came back to himself, he would describe what he'd seen: angels, demons, the Virgin Mary, dead relatives, events that hadn't happened yet, but would. His father thought he was simple, possibly damaged in the head. His mother thought he was holy. The other children thought he was creepy and avoided him. But there was one thing even his harshest critics had to acknowledge: the boy could heal animals, horses specifically. A horse would go lame, or develop colic, or start acting strange for no apparent reason. The vet, when one could be found, would shake his head and recommend putting the animal down. Horses were valuable, and losing one was a financial disaster for a poor farming family. But then someone would remember the Rasputin boy, and they'd bring young Grigori to the stable. He would place his hands on the animal, close his eyes, stand there, perfectly still, for what felt like hours, and something would happen. The horse would calm, the lameness would disappear, the sickness would pass. It shouldn't have worked. There was no medical explanation for it, but it did work. Again and again and again. This was Rasputin's first taste of power, the ability to do something that others couldn't, to fix what was broken through sheer force of will or faith, or whatever strange energy flowed through his hands. He liked that feeling. At 18, Rasputin married a local girl named Praskovia Dubrovina. She was 22, plain-faced, strong, practical, a good match for a peasant farmer. Over the next several years, she would give him 4 children. But marriage and fatherhood didn't settle Grigori. If anything, they seemed to make him more restless, more aware that his life was slipping away in this nothing village, doing nothing work, destined to die, having changed nothing. He drank, heavily. The vodka out here was harsh, gut-burning stuff, but it did what alcohol has always done. It quieted the noise in his head, the visions, the constant feeling that he was meant for something more than this. He fought, got into brawls in the village, built a reputation as someone with a violent temper when drunk, which was most of the time. And then, one night in 1887, he stole a horse. The sources disagree on the details. Some say he was drunk and took the horse as a prank. Others say he was caught stealing it to sell for money. What's certain is that the community caught him, and in a village this small, horse theft was a serious crime. He faced a choice: punishment from the village elders, possibly even exile to somewhere even worse than Pokrovskoye, or flee to the nearest monastery and claim sanctuary. He chose the monastery. The Verkhoturya monastery was about 250 miles away, a journey of several weeks on foot through wilderness. But monasteries had rules. They had to take in pilgrims seeking spiritual refuge. Once inside their walls, you were protected from secular justice. Rasputin arrived at Verkhoturya exhausted, probably terrified, definitely desperate. He had no idea that walking through those monastery gates would change his life forever. The monastery was unlike anything Rasputin had ever experienced. First, there was the silence. In the village, silence was rare. There were always animals making noise, people talking, children crying. But in the monastery, silence was enforced. The monks moved like ghosts through the corridors, communicating with hand gestures, their faces serene and distant. Then there was the ritual, the endless cycle of prayers, 7 times a day, starting before dawn and ending late at night. The chanting, the incense, the icons glowing in candlelight, the sense that every moment was sacred, that every action was a form of worship. For someone like Rasputin, chaotic, undisciplined, driven by impulses he didn't understand, the structure must have been both alien and strangely compelling. But the real transformation came from the man he met there. The monastery housed a spiritual wanderer named Macquarie. He was what Russians called a stranik, a pilgrim who spent his entire life walking from holy site to holy site, never settling, never owning anything, existing in a state of constant spiritual seeking. Macquarie was famous. He'd walked all the way to Mount Athos in Greece. He'd visited the holy sites of Jerusalem. He'd spent years wandering through Russia, depending on the charity of strangers, sleeping rough, coming close to death more times than he could count. And he claimed that through this suffering, through this deliberate rejection of comfort and stability, he'd achieved something like enlightenment, direct contact with God. Visions that showed him truth. Rasputin was mesmerized. Here was a man who had transformed suffering into power, who had taken the chaos and hardship of peasant life, the things that made Rasputin want to drink himself into oblivion, and turned them into a path to the divine. More than that, Macquarie had visited the Tsar and Tsarina. He'd been received at the Winter Palace. He'd gone from being a nobody peasant to someone important enough to advise the most powerful people in Russia. This was possible. This life was possible. Rasputin spent 3 months at the monastery. He didn't become a monk. That required commitments he wasn't willing to make. But he absorbed everything Macquarie taught him about pilgrimage, about the spiritual power of suffering, about the tradition of holy fools who spoke truth to power, and about something else, something Macquarie probably didn't teach directly, but which Rasputin learned from the other pilgrims and wanderers who passed through the monastery. He learned about the sects. The Russian Orthodox Church was powerful, official, tied to the state. But beneath its surface, Russia was honeycombed with secret religious movements, sects that had split off from the official church, that practiced Christianity in ways the patriarchs in Moscow would consider heretical. These sects were illegal, dangerous to join. If caught, you could be exiled to even worse places than Siberia, which was saying something. But they offered something the official church didn't: direct, personal, ecstatic contact with the divine. The most infamous of these sects were the Klisti, the flagellants. The Klisti believed that organized religion was corrupt, that priests were unnecessary, that any person could achieve direct communion with God through specific rituals that involved dancing, spinning, and working themselves into a trance state. They called it rejoicing or spiritual beer, a state of religious ecstasy so intense it was like being drunk, except the intoxication came from the Holy Spirit itself. Their services were secret, held in basements or forests. They would gather at night, light candles, and begin to sing. Simple, repetitive songs that would go on for hours. And as they sang, they would begin to move. Swaying at first, then spinning faster and faster, around and around, until the room became a whirlwind of bodies and sound. In this state, they would prophesy, speak in tongues, have visions, experience what they believed was direct possession by divine forces. And then, and this is the part that made the Klisti truly notorious, they would engage in ritual sex. The theology behind this was complex, but the basic idea was this: by deliberately sinning in the flesh and then repenting with absolute sincerity, you could achieve a state of grace that was impossible through merely avoiding sin. You had to fall in order to be lifted up. You had to descend into darkness to appreciate the light. They called it sinning to drive out sin. Whether Rasputin actually joined the Dynasty is debated by historians. He would later deny it, and there's no solid proof. But there's also no question that he knew about them, that he encountered their ideas during his wanderings, and that those ideas would become central to his own spiritual practice. The idea that salvation required sin, that you couldn't be pure without first being impure, that the path to God ran through transgression, this was the key that would unlock everything else in Rasputin's life. When Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoye after those 3 months, everyone agreed that something fundamental had changed. The drunk, violent horse thief was gone. In his place was someone else, someone who spoke about God with absolute conviction, who could pray for hours without moving, whose eyes had a strange, penetrating quality that made people uncomfortable. He built a chapel in the cellar of his house and began holding prayer services. He stopped drinking, not forever, but for long stretches. He walked barefoot, even in winter, claiming that the suffering brought him closer to God, and he began to wander. Over the next several years, Rasputin became a stranic, like Macquarie. He left his wife and children for months at a time, sometimes years. He walked thousands of miles, visiting holy sites across Russia. He went south to the monastery at Kazan, further south still to Mount Athos in Greece, a journey of over 2,000 miles on foot. He practiced what's called podvig, spiritual struggle through deliberate physical suffering. He would walk until his feet bled, go days without eating, stand motionless in prayer for so long that his legs would give out beneath him, sleep in forests where wolves prowled, deliberately expose himself to mosquitoes and let them feed on him until his skin was covered in welts. The theory was that by destroying the physical body, you liberated the spiritual one. By pushing yourself past normal human endurance, you broke through into something beyond human. And Rasputin discovered that he could do this, that he had a capacity for suffering that was almost superhuman, that he could push his body further than most people thought possible. More importantly, he discovered that this suffering gave him power. When he came back to villages after weeks of walking and fasting, he looked like a saint from an icon, skeletal, wild-eyed, burning with something that people couldn't quite name but recognized as holy. And his healing abilities had grown stronger. People began to seek him out, not just for sick horses now, but for themselves. Headaches that wouldn't go away, chronic pain, depression, mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't diagnose or cure. He would pray over them, put his hands on them, look into their eyes with that strange, penetrating stare, and something would happen. The pain would ease, the depression would lift, the mysterious symptoms would disappear. He developed a following. People who believed he was genuinely holy, touched by God, capable of miracles. But there were others who were convinced he'd made a deal with something darker. By the early 1900s, Rasputin had built a reputation that extended far beyond Pokrovskoye. Stories about the wandering holy man from Siberia began to circulate through the network of monasteries and churches. But alongside the stories of his healing powers came darker rumors. Women who visited him for spiritual guidance reported that his methods were unusual. He would insist they confess their sins in explicit detail, their sexual sins especially, and then he would tell them that to truly repent, they needed to commit the sin again, but this time in a sacred context, with him as their spiritual guide. Some women were horrified and fled. Others stayed. There were whispers that in the chapel beneath his house, Rasputin held services that looked nothing like Orthodox Christianity, that there was dancing, spinning, frenzy, that participants would work themselves into states of religious ecstasy and then collapse into each other's arms, that the chapel had become a place where the line between worship and orgy had disappeared completely. Rasputin's explanation, when confronted, was always the same. You cannot understand God's grace until you've experienced sin. You cannot truly repent unless you've truly fallen. The deeper the sin, the greater the potential for salvation. Sinning to drive out sin. Some called him a prophet. Others called him a heretic. A few called him the Antichrist. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Grigori Rasputin possessed some kind of power. Whether it came from God or the devil was open to debate. And in 1903, that power caught the attention of someone who mattered. Bishop Feofan, a senior Orthodox cleric, heard about Rasputin and invited him to St. Petersburg to meet with religious officials. Feofan was impressed. He declared Rasputin a genuine holy fool, blessed by God with the gift of spiritual insight. He gave Rasputin letters of introduction to some of the most powerful people in Russia. And with those letters, the semi-literate peasant from the edge of nowhere began his journey to the center of power. St. Petersburg was waiting for him. And the Romanov dynasty, though they didn't know it yet, was about to meet the man who would seal their doom. St. Petersburg in 1903 was one of the strangest cities in the world. Built by Peter the Great 2 centuries earlier as Russia's window to the West, it was supposed to represent Enlightenment rationality, European culture, modern thinking, wide boulevards, neoclassical architecture, grand palaces, everything ordered, planned, designed to show that Russia was no longer a backward Asian empire, but a sophisticated European power. But beneath that rational surface, the city was drowning in mysticism. The aristocracy, bored, wealthy, desperate for meaning in lives of empty privilege, had become obsessed with the occult. Seances were held in palace drawing rooms every night. Theosophists, spiritualists, mystics, and charlatans of every variety prowled the salons, offering contact with the dead, glimpses of the future, secret knowledge that transcended mere reason. The bookshops were full of texts on numerology, astrology, Kabbalah, Eastern mysticism. Society ladies consulted fortune tellers before making any important decision. Men who claimed to be avatars of ancient Egyptian priests found eager audiences among the educated elite. And at the very top of this pyramid of credulity sat the imperial family itself. Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra, were perhaps the most superstitious people in Russia. They kept psychics on retainer. They held regular seances, trying to contact Nicholas's dead father for advice. They believed implicitly in prophecies, omens, and signs from God. This wasn't unusual for the time, but it was dangerous when the people who believed these things had absolute power over 130 million people. Into this fevered, mystical atmosphere walked Grigori Rasputin, carrying letters of introduction from Bishop Feofan, wearing peasant clothes that probably hadn't been washed in months, and trailing an aura of wild spiritual power that made aristocrats' drawing rooms feel suddenly too small. The first thing everyone noticed about Rasputin were his eyes, grey-blue, pale as winter ice, but intense, penetrating, When he looked at you, it felt like he could see through to your soul, like he knew your secrets without you speaking them. Multiple witnesses describe the same experience. Rasputin would fix them with his stare, and they would feel paralyzed, unable to look away, unable to think clearly. A sensation like electricity running through their body. Some said he could dilate his pupils at will, making his eyes appear to grow larger, darker, more hypnotic. Others claimed he practiced a form of hypnosis common among Siberian shamans. Still others believed it was simply the force of an overwhelming personality focused entirely on you. Whatever the explanation, the effect was undeniable. Princess Olga Alexandrovna, the Tsar's sister, described meeting him. He had the most extraordinary eyes, light blue with a depth that was truly hypnotic. When he looked at you, it was impossible to break away. A society lady named Lily Dane wrote, "His eyes held mine, those light-colored eyes with a curious phosphorescent light in them. I felt I was fainting. My legs were like cotton wool." The composer, Sergei Prokofiev, encountered him at a party. He had a way of looking straight into your eyes, and it seemed as if he were hypnotizing you. Many people feared his gaze. This was Rasputin's primary weapon in St. Petersburg society. Not theological knowledge, his understanding of official Orthodox doctrine was sketchy at best. Not political cunning, he was too impulsive, too honest in strange ways to be a skilled political operator. Just this, overwhelming personal magnetism, the ability to make people feel that they were in the presence of something beyond the ordinary, something powerful, possibly holy, possibly demonic, but definitely not normal. And in a society desperate for authentic spiritual experience, desperate for anything that felt real, in a world of performance and protocol, Rasputin's raw, unfiltered intensity was intoxicating. Rasputin's introduction to St. Petersburg society followed a predictable pattern. Bishop Feofan brought him to meet with senior clergy first. They were intrigued by this strange peasant holy man. Some were impressed by his apparent piety. Others were immediately suspicious. His interpretations of scripture were unorthodox, to put it mildly, and his personal hygiene left much to be desired. But Feofan vouched for him, and that was enough to get him into the next tier: aristocratic salons. These were the social engine of St. Petersburg high society. Every evening, the wealthy would gather in someone's palace to discuss philosophy, art, politics, to hear the latest gossip, to see and be seen, and increasingly, to meet mystics. A Grand Duchess named Militsa and her sister Anastasia, known in court circles as the Crows because of their black clothing and ominous predictions, had made themselves the gatekeepers to the occult for St. Petersburg's elite. They'd spent years traveling through Montenegro, Russia, and the Middle East, collecting mystics the way other aristocrats collected art. They'd already introduced Nicholas and Alexandra to a French charlatan named Dr. Philippe, who claimed he could determine the sex of unborn children and contact the dead. When Philippe died in 1905, the sisters needed a replacement Feofan, introduced them to Rasputin, and the Crows immediately recognized his potential. They brought him to their salon. Rasputin arrived in traditional peasant clothing, a long tunic belted at the waist, baggy trousers tucked into worn boots, his hair long and unkempt, his beard tangled and dirty. In a room full of men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns worth more than a peasant earned in a lifetime, he should have looked ridiculous, an embarrassment. Instead, he commanded attention immediately. He didn't bow to the aristocrats, didn't use honorifics, or observe the social niceties that governed every interaction in this stratified society. He called men and women by their first names, even when they were princes and princesses. He spoke in a thick Siberian accent, using crude peasant phrases, and rather than being offended, the aristocrats were fascinated. Here was someone authentic, someone who didn't play by the rules of their artificial social world, someone from the real Russia, the peasant Russia that existed beyond the cities, the Russia of deep Orthodox faith and folk wisdom. He would tell them, bluntly, that their lives were spiritually empty, that their wealth was meaningless, that they were addicted to luxury and had forgotten God. Any normal person saying this would have been thrown out immediately. But when Rasputin said it, looking at them with those hypnotic eyes, speaking with absolute conviction, they felt it was true, and they wanted him to save them from their emptiness, women especially, aristocratic women whose lives consisted of endless social obligations, loveless political marriages, and crushing boredom found in Rasputin something they'd been missing. A man who seemed to truly see them, to care about their souls rather than their titles or dowries. He would pray over them, hold their hands, look into their eyes, tell them that God loved them, that their sins could be forgiven, that they were beautiful in his sight, and many of them fell a little bit in love with him, or a lot in love with him. Not everyone was charmed. As Rasputin's fame grew in the salon circuit, some members of the Orthodox Church hierarchy began to worry. Reports reached them of his sexual teachings, of the rumors from Siberia about what happened in the chapel beneath his house. An ecclesiastical investigation was quietly launched. Rasputin was questioned about his alleged connection to the Dynasty sect. He denied everything. He was a simple peasant, he said, a man of faith. His only goal was to help people find God. But the investigators weren't convinced. One church official wrote, "This Rasputin is an uneducated peasant who has learned by heart a few prayers and knows how to exploit the religious sentiment of certain society ladies. His influence is dangerous and should be stopped immediately." The problem was, stopped by whom? By 1905, Rasputin had protection from the very top because he'd finally achieved his goal. He'd met the Tsar and Tsarina. November 1st, 1905. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, 15 miles outside St. Petersburg. The Crows arranged a private dinner. Just Nicholas, Alexandra, the two Montenegrine princesses, and their special guest from Siberia. Rasputin arrived wearing his peasant clothes, stood before the Emperor of all Russia, the most powerful monarch in Europe, and didn't bow, didn't show any particular deference. Instead, he simply looked at them, studied them with those pale blue eyes. Nicholas was 37 years old, slight, bearded, with the perpetually worried expression of a man who knew he wasn't really qualified for his job. He'd become Tsar at 26 when his father died unexpectedly, and had spent every day since then feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility. Alexandra was 33, beautiful in a cold way, intense, anxious. German by birth, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she'd converted to Orthodox Christianity with the fervor of a true believer. She was desperate for religious guidance, desperate for someone who could connect her to God. And she was terrified, absolutely terrified, because she had a secret that only a handful of people in the world knew, a secret that, if it became public, could destabilize the entire Russian Empire. Rasputin looked at the royal couple, and something in his expression changed. Later, He would claim that the Virgin Mary had told him about the Tsarevich's illness during a vision. More likely, the crows had briefed him, or he'd heard rumors. However he knew, he clearly knew something. "Your son," he said simply. "Tell me about your son." Alexandra went pale, because Alexei, the Tsarevich, the long-awaited heir to the Romanov throne, was dying. Slowly, painfully, inevitably. He had hemophilia. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A small cut that would heal in minutes for a normal person can bleed for hours for a hemophiliac internal bleeding. From a bump, a fall, any minor injury can cause massive damage. For children with severe hemophilia, every moment is dangerous. Every playground fall could be fatal. The disease causes excruciating pain as blood pools in joints and muscles. Sufferers often become disabled by their teens, crippled by repeated internal hemorrhages. There was no cure, no treatment, nothing doctors could do except watch and hope each crisis passed. And Alexei's case was severe. He'd inherited the disease from his mother, who'd inherited it from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. It was a curse that ran through European royal families, the result of centuries of inbreeding designed to keep power within a small circle of related dynasties. For Nicholas and Alexandra, Alexei's condition was a personal tragedy and a political disaster. The empire needed an heir. The dynasty's stability depended on smooth succession. But how could Alexei become Tsar if he might die at any moment? If he was too weak to perform the physical duties expected of a monarch? The imperial couple had consulted the best doctors in Europe. All of them said the same thing. There's nothing we can do. Keep him quiet. Avoid injuries. Pray. They'd tried mystics too. Dr. Philippe had claimed he could cure the boy, but he'd failed and died before seeing any results. When Rasputin asked about Alexei, Alexandra must have felt a surge of hope mixed with despair. Hope because here was another holy man, and maybe, just maybe, this one would succeed where others had failed. Despair because she'd been disappointed so many times before. "The boy bleeds," Rasputin said. It wasn't a question. Alexandra nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Let me see him," Rasputin said. And that night, for the first time, Grigori Rasputin entered the nursery where the Tsarevich lay. What happened that night is disputed by historians. The official account, recorded in Alexandra's diary, says that Alexei had been in severe pain from internal bleeding in his leg. The doctors could do nothing. The boy was crying, his small body racked with agony. Rasputin asked everyone to leave. He wanted to be alone with the child. The servants, the doctors, even Alexandra herself stepped into the hallway, waited. They could hear Rasputin's voice through the door, low, rhythmic, prayer-like, but they couldn't make out the words. 30 minutes passed, an hour, then silence. When the door finally opened, Rasputin emerged. His face was pale, drenched with sweat. He looked exhausted, as if he'd physically wrestled with something. "The boy will live," he said simply. "He will sleep now. Do not disturb him." Alexandra rushed past him into the nursery. Alexei was asleep, calm, his face peaceful rather than twisted with pain. By morning, the bleeding had stopped, the pain had subsided. Within days, Alexei was up and playing again, as if the crisis had never happened. The doctors were baffled. They'd seen the boy in the grip of a hemorrhagic episode that should have taken days to resolve, possibly leading to permanent joint damage. Instead, he'd recovered in hours. How? Modern medical theory suggests several possibilities. Hemophilia is affected by stress. High anxiety can make bleeding worse, while calm can help the body's limited clotting mechanisms work more effectively. Rasputin may have simply calmed the child, reducing stress, allowing natural recovery. Another theory, Rasputin, with his peasant background, didn't trust doctors or aspirin, which was commonly prescribed in that era. Aspirin thins blood, exactly what you don't want for a hemophiliac. By keeping doctors away and preventing them from giving Alexei aspirin, Rasputin may have accidentally provided effective treatment by doing nothing. Or maybe, and this is the explanation Alexandra believed with absolute conviction, Rasputin really could heal. That whatever force allowed him to cure horses and relieve headaches could also stop bleeding in a dying child. Whatever the explanation, the result was clear. Rasputin had done what the best doctors in Europe couldn't do. He'd saved the Tsarevich, and in doing so, he'd made himself indispensable to the most powerful woman in Russia. After that first healing, Rasputin became a regular visitor to the Alexander Palace. He was given private quarters, allowed to visit without announcement, granted access to the imperial family that even senior officials were denied. The imperial children, 4 daughters in addition to Alexei, called him our friend. Nicholas and Alexandra simply called him Grigori, with the informal, intimate form of address used only with family. He would visit, sometimes staying for hours, praying with Alexandra, discussing spiritual matters, playing with the children. The formality that governed every other aspect of imperial life disappeared when Rasputin was present. He was the one person who treated them like normal people rather than semi-divine rulers. For Alexandra especially, Rasputin became emotionally essential. She was isolated, never fully accepted by Russian aristocracy because of her German origins, perpetually anxious about her son's health. Lonely in her position as Empress, Rasputin gave her what she desperately needed: certainty. He told her with complete confidence that Alexei would be fine as long as she trusted in God and trusted in him, that the dynasty was protected by divine will, that she was a good mother, a good empress, and that her critics were wrong. She believed him absolutely. And when Alexei had another bleeding crisis and Rasputin once again stopped it, either through his mysterious healing power or simply by calming the boy and keeping aspirin-prescribing doctors away, Alexandra's faith became unshakable. Without him, she told her lady-in-waiting, the child would have died. God sent Grigori to us. He is our savior. This conviction would never waver, not through scandals, not through public outcry, not through the warnings of family members and advisors who could see the danger in giving a peasant mystic such enormous influence. Nicholas was more cautious, but he too came to rely on Rasputin. The Tsar was a weak man, plagued by indecision, who desperately wanted someone to tell him what to do. Rasputin, with his peasant certainty, his absolute confidence, provided that guidance. But the imperial couple made a critical mistake. They assumed that because Rasputin could heal their son, his wisdom extended to everything else. That his spiritual insight meant he understood politics, military strategy, governance. He didn't. Rasputin was a peasant mystic with genuine healing gifts, however they worked. But he had no education, no political sophistication, no understanding of the complex machinery of governing an empire of 130 million people. That wouldn't stop Alexandra from asking his advice on everything from military appointments to declarations of war. And it wouldn't stop Rasputin from giving that advice, convinced that the voice he heard in his head was God rather than his own ignorance. But all of that was still years away. For now, in 1905, Rasputin was simply grateful. He'd achieved his dream. He was an advisor to the Tsar and Tsarina, a holy fool in the tradition of those who'd guided Russian rulers for centuries. He had power, real power. And like everyone who gains power, they never expected to have. He had no idea how dangerous it would become. By 1906, Rasputin had moved permanently to St. Petersburg. He rented an apartment at 3 Gorokhovaya Street, a middle-class building just a few blocks from the Imperial Palace complex. The apartment wasn't large, just a few rooms, sparsely furnished, but it became the center of Rasputin's growing influence. Every day, from morning until late at night, people came to see him. Petitioners seeking his help with the imperial bureaucracy, society ladies wanting spiritual guidance, peasants from the countryside who'd heard he could heal the sick, journalists trying to get interviews, spies sent by the secret police to monitor his activities. The door was always open. Rasputin refused to turn anyone away. Inside, the scene was chaotic. People crowded into the small rooms, waiting for their turn to speak with him. Some waited hours, some waited all day. When Rasputin received them, he would look into their eyes with that hypnotic stare, ask them what they needed, listen sometimes, other times interrupt with a sudden pronouncement: God loves you, your sins are forgiven, go in peace, or you are troubled by demons, you must suffer to drive them out, or come back tonight, we will pray together. For those invited to return at night, the experience was different. Rasputin called his female followers his little ladies, or sometimes his fools, a term of endearment in his cosmology, meaning those who were humble enough to accept spiritual teaching. They came from all levels of society: aristocratic wives and daughters, middle-class women, prostitutes, peasants. What they had in common was a hunger for something: spiritual meaning, relief from boredom, genuine human connection, or simply proximity to power. The nighttime gatherings in Rasputin's apartment followed a pattern that witnesses described in shocking detail to police investigators. It would begin with tea and food. Rasputin would sit at the head of his simple table, his followers arranged around him. He would eat, loudly, messily, in the peasant manner, using his hands, wiping them on his tunic. His table manners were deliberately crude, a rejection of aristocratic refinement. Then he would begin to talk, not formal sermons or theological lectures, just rambling thoughts, observations, parables, stories from his wandering years, interpretations of scripture that bore little resemblance to orthodox teaching. And at some point, he would begin to develop his central theme, the theology of redemptive sin. How can you know God's mercy if you've never needed mercy? He would ask, how can you understand forgiveness if you've never been truly fallen? The logic was twisted but seductive. If sin is necessary for redemption, and redemption is the goal of Christian life, then sin itself becomes a kind of spiritual tool. The holy books say that there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance, Rasputin would say, quoting Luke 15:7. So which is better, to be the 99 who never sinned, or the one who fell and was lifted up? Most Orthodox theologians would have called this heresy immediately, but Rasputin had an answer ready. The Church understands the letter of the law. I understand the spirit. Christ forgave the prostitute. He ate with sinners, he touched lepers. Why? Because they needed him. The righteous don't need a healer, only the sick do. And then, slowly, carefully, he would move from theory to practice. You, he would say, fixing a woman with his stare. You carry guilt. I can see it in your eyes. What is your sin? The woman would confess. Sometimes something minor, a harsh word to a servant, a moment of pride. Sometimes something more significant, adultery, theft, cruelty. Rasputin would listen, nodding. Then, "And have you truly repented?" "Yes, Father. I've prayed for forgiveness." Prayer is good, but how can you repent of something you don't fully understand? You must experience the sin completely to understand why it needs forgiveness. You must fall all the way to the bottom before God can lift you back up. I don't understand." "Come," Rasputin would say, standing, "I will show you." What happened in Rasputin's back room has been documented by his victims, by police surveillance, by his enemies, and occasionally by his supporters trying to defend him. The accounts vary in detail, but agree on the essentials. Rasputin would take a woman into his bedroom, close the door. The others would wait in the main room, listening to muffled voices, prayer-like chanting, and eventually other sounds. One woman who escaped early in the encounter and went to the police described her experience. "He sat me down on the bed. He began to pray, standing over me. His voice was hypnotic. I felt my will leaving me, as if I were falling asleep but still conscious. Then he placed his hands on my shoulders and told me that to achieve true humility, I must remove my clothing. That shame was a barrier to God, and I must destroy that barrier." I refused. I stood to leave. But he grabbed my arm, not violently, but firmly, and looked into my eyes, and I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed. He said, "You are afraid because you are still proud. Pride is the greatest sin. You must kill your pride to reach God." He began to undress me himself. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. It was as if I were watching it happen to someone else. And then he forced himself on me, all the while praying, telling me this was holy, that I was being purified through sin. When it was over, he made me kneel and pray with him. He said that now I understood what it meant to fall, and that my repentance would be all the more powerful because my sin was all the more deep. He said I was blessed. Other women told similar stories. The pattern was always the same: spiritual language, hypnotic manipulation, then sexual assault presented as religious ritual. Some women reported the abuse and fled. Others returned night after night, convinced that Rasputin was genuinely helping them achieve spiritual enlightenment. One woman, Olga Loktina, became so devoted that she abandoned her husband and children, moved into Rasputin's apartment building, and declared that he was Christ incarnate and she was the Virgin Mary. When she saw him with other women, she would scream and have hysterical fits, believing she was witnessing the crucifixion. Her family had her committed to an asylum, but whenever she was released, she would return immediately to Rasputin. We need to be clear about something. Rasputin almost certainly believed his own theology. This wasn't a cold, calculated charlatan knowingly exploiting vulnerable women. It was something more complex and more disturbing. Rasputin genuinely seemed to believe that sexuality was a path to the divine, that the moment of orgasm, that brief obliteration of self, was akin to mystical communion with God, that the shame and guilt that followed sexual sin could be transformed through proper spiritual practice into fuel for religious ecstasy. This wasn't as radical as it might seem. Many mystical traditions make connections between sexual energy and spiritual power. Tantric Buddhism, sacred sexuality in some forms of Hinduism. Even Christian mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila describe their encounters with the divine in explicitly erotic terms. The difference was that Rasputin weaponized these ideas. He used theology to justify his own impulses. He took mystical concepts and twisted them into permission for sexual assault. And because he had genuine healing powers, or what everyone interpreted as healing powers, his victims and followers could convince themselves that the abuse was worth it, that they were touching holiness, even as they were being violated. One of his defenders, a woman named Maria Golovina, wrote, "People who have never understood the depth of religious experience cannot understand Rasputin. Yes, there was physical contact, but it was transcendent. He was showing us that the body and spirit are not separate, that to deny the body is to deny part of God's creation. In other words, he assaulted us, but we convinced ourselves it was holy." If the apartment was where Rasputin practiced his theology on individuals, the bathhouse was where he performed his most dramatic rituals. Russian bathhouses, banyas, were central to peasant culture. More than just places to get clean, they were sites of magic, healing, and spiritual cleansing. Most Siberians were born in bathhouses. Exorcisms were performed there. Brides prepared for weddings in them. Rasputin was a regular at several banyas in St. Petersburg, and his behavior there became legendary, and increasingly disturbing witnesses described him arriving with a group of followers, both men and women. They would undress and enter the steam room together. Then Rasputin would begin what he called spiritual combat. He would work himself into a frenzy, shouting about demons, about the devil, about the struggle between flesh and spirit. He would beat himself with birch branches, a traditional Russian bathhouse practice, but with far more violence than normal. Then he would turn on the women present. "You carry demons," he would shout. "I see them in you. They must be driven out." And he would beat them with the branches, not gently, hard enough to leave welts, to draw blood. The women would cry out. Some would collapse. Others would enter trance-like states, speaking in tongues, prophesying, and then, according to multiple witnesses, the spiritual combat would transform into sexual frenzy. It was like watching animals, one shocked observer reported. There was no humanity left in it, just bodies and screaming, and Rasputin at the center, claiming he was wrestling with the devil himself. After these sessions, Rasputin would emerge from the bathhouse looking haggard, aged, as if the experience had physically drained him. He would stumble into the street, sometimes talking to himself, arguing with invisible presences. Because here's the thing that makes Rasputin more tragic than simply monstrous. He appears to have genuinely believed he was fighting demons. Multiple witnesses described seeing him on the streets late at night, clearly drunk, arguing with empty air, having full conversations with entities no one else could see. "Get away from me," he would shout. "I know what you are. You won't take me." Then, moments later, in a different tone, "Yes, I know I must. But the cost is too high." Back and forth, as if two entities were warring inside his head. His friend Filipov described Rasputin coming to him one night, weeping, saying, I'm not holy anymore, I've become a devil. The devil lives in me now. I can feel him. I try to push him out, but he's too strong. This was a man who'd spent years practicing podvig, spiritual struggle through physical suffering, who'd walked thousands of miles, starved himself, deliberately courted pain and hardship as a path to God. But somewhere along the way, the struggle had consumed him. The demons he'd been fighting had gotten inside, or maybe they'd always been inside. Maybe the visions he'd had as a child weren't divine at all. Maybe what he'd interpreted as holy power was something else entirely. He couldn't tell anymore. That's the horror of it. He would commit sexual assault in his apartment, convinced he was performing a sacred ritual, then stumble out hours later, arguing with demons in the street, aware at some level that he'd done something wrong, but unable to stop himself from doing it again the next night. The Dynasty doctrine of sinning to drive out sin had trapped him in a terrible cycle. Sin, repent. Sin again more deeply, repent more fervently. Sin again, worse still. In an escalating spiral that he mistook for spiritual progress, and all the while, his power at court was growing. Because whatever was happening to Rasputin personally, his ability to heal the Tsarevich remained. Whenever Alexei had a bleeding crisis, Rasputin could calm him, could make the pain stop, could prevent death. Alexandra didn't care about the scandals, didn't believe the reports of sexual impropriety. Her son would be dead without Rasputin. That was all that mattered. And so the mad monk was protected by the highest power in Russia, even as his personal demons dragged him deeper into darkness. By 1910, the rumors about Rasputin had grown too loud to ignore. The Orthodox Church launched a full investigation, trying to determine if he was truly connected to the Dynasty sect Bishop Feofan, who had initially championed Rasputin, now turned against him. Convinced that his protege had been corrupted by demonic forces, police opened a file on Rasputin, assigning agents to follow him constantly and document his activities. The reports they filed paint a disturbing picture. December 1st, subject visited Gorokhovaya apartment, received visitors until 3 p.m., departed with prostitute to bathhouse, returned at 6 p.m., visited Golovin's, left at 8 p.m., travelled to Alexander Palace, admitted without delay. December 5th, subject extremely drunk, accosted women on street, entered bathhouse with 2 prostitutes, observed through window engaging in activities of lewd nature, departed at midnight, proceeded to apartment, received female visitor of aristocratic appearance. December 15th, subject visited apartments of multiple society ladies throughout day, evening, brought woman to bathhouse. Observers report hearing screaming and claims subject was performing exorcism. Subject emerged at 2 a.m., arguing with self about demons. The secret police compiled hundreds of these reports, but they were powerless to act, because whenever authorities tried to move against Rasputin, Alexandra intervened. She would summon the police chief, the Minister of Interior, whoever was threatening her holy man, and make it clear, leave Grigori alone. He is protected by the throne. And that was the end of it. In a truly autocratic monarchy, the Tsar's word, or in this case the Tsarina's, was absolute law. There was no higher authority to appeal to. Rasputin was untouchable. But not everyone was deterred by imperial protection. A monk named Iliodor had initially befriended Rasputin, but gradually became convinced that Rasputin was the Antichrist. He began preaching against him, calling him a heretic and a demon. Another cleric, Bishop Hermogen, joined the campaign. Together, In December 1911, they lured Rasputin to a monastery basement under false pretenses. When Rasputin arrived, expecting a friendly theological discussion, he found himself surrounded by hostile monks and clergy. "You are possessed," Hermogen declared. "You practice the rites of the Klisti. You corrupt women with false doctrine. You must confess your sins and submit to the church's authority." Rasputin tried to leave. They blocked the doors. What happened next is described in Rasputin's own words and confirmed by witnesses. Hermogen grabbed him by the genitals and shouted, "This is what's leading you. This is the devil's tool inside you." Then they beat him with a crucifix of all things. Iliodor struck him repeatedly in the head while other monks held him down, chanting prayers of exorcism. "We will beat the demons out of you," Hermogen said. Rasputin, bleeding and terrified, managed to break free and fled. He went directly to Alexandra and told her that church officials had tried to kill him. Her response was immediate and ruthless. Both Hermogen and Iliodor were stripped of their positions and exiled from St. Petersburg. The message was clear. Anyone who touched Rasputin would face the Empress's wrath. But Iliodor wasn't finished. Convinced that demonic forces were protecting Rasputin and that only extreme measures would work, he recruited an agent to finish what he'd started. Her name was Kionia Guseva. She was a former prostitute who'd lost her nose to syphilis and had become a fanatical religious devotee of Iliodor. She was mentally unstable, violent, and absolutely convinced that Rasputin was the devil incarnate. In June 1914, she tracked Rasputin to his home village of Pokrovskoye, where he'd returned for a visit. She approached him on the street, asking for charity. When he reached into his pocket for coins, she pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the abdomen. "I've killed the Antichrist," she screamed, as Rasputin collapsed, his intestines spilling from the wound. Against all odds, Rasputin survived. The surgery took hours. He was bedridden for months, but he lived. And while he was recovering in Siberia, unable to travel, unable to communicate effectively with the capital, something happened that would change the course of world history. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and Europe began its descent into the worst war the world had yet seen. Rasputin's recovery from the stabbing was slow and agonizing. He spent weeks in a hospital bed, hovering between life and death, pumped full of opium to manage the pain. But even through the haze of drugs and trauma, he remained aware of the outside world. And as news reached him of the political crisis following Franz Ferdinand's assassination, of Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, of Germany and Russia mobilizing their armies, he understood immediately what was coming. On July 17, 1914, from his hospital bed in Siberia, Rasputin dictated a telegram to Tsar Nicholas. "A terrible storm cloud hangs over Russia. Disaster, grief, murky darkness, and no light. A whole ocean of tears. There is no measuring it. There is no describing it. I know they all want war from you, the loyal and the faithful. But this is destruction. The disaster will be great. The suffering infinite. It is the end of everything." He begged the Tsar not to mobilize, not to go to war, prophesied that Russia would be destroyed if it entered the conflict. Nicholas received the telegram, read it, and ignored it. Because for the first time in his weak, indecisive reign, Nicholas was popular. The patriotic fervor that swept Russia after Austria-Hungary's aggression had unified the country. Crowds cheered him in the streets. His generals were confident. His advisors promised quick victory. How could he refuse when the nation was demanding action? When his allies needed Russia's support? When refusing would make him look cowardly? 3 days later, Russia began full mobilization. Within a week, Germany declared war on Russia. Within a month, all of Europe was at war. Rasputin, still recovering in Siberia, wept when he heard the news. He told his daughter Maria, "This is the end of everything. The Tsar has signed Russia's death warrant." He was right. World War I was a catastrophe for Russia on a scale that's hard to comprehend. In the first 6 months, Russia lost over 1 million men, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies simply ceased to exist, destroyed by German artillery and machine guns. Russian soldiers went into battle with rifles that didn't work, sometimes without rifles at all, told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. They had inadequate winter clothing. Food supplies were chaotic. Medical care was almost non-existent, and they kept dying, by the hundreds of thousands, then by the millions. By 1915, the Russian economy was collapsing under the strain. Food shortages in the cities, inflation making bread unaffordable, factories shutting down for lack of fuel and raw materials. Refugees from the war zone flooded into St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd in 1914 because Petersburg sounded too German. They brought horror stories of German brutality, of villages burned, of civilians massacred. The city became a pressure cooker of misery, rage, and desperation. And into this chaos, Rasputin returned. In August 1915, Nicholas made a fateful decision. He would personally take command of the armies at the front. It was a terrible idea. Nicholas had no military training, no strategic vision. His presence would solve nothing and would instead tie him personally to every defeat, every disaster. But he was convinced it was his duty as Tsar, as commander of the faithful. He would lead his men into battle like the warrior Tsars of old, which meant leaving Alexandra in charge of the government. This was the moment Rasputin's influence reached its peak, and the moment it became truly destructive. Alexandra, terrified by the responsibility suddenly thrust upon her, turned completely to Rasputin for guidance. Not just on spiritual matters now, but on everything. Every government decision, every ministerial appointment, every policy question. She would write to Nicholas daily, and her letters were full of Rasputin's opinions. And says, "You must dismiss the Minister of War and appoint Polivanov." Our friend says, "You must dismiss the friend," believes we should move the headquarters to Mogilev. Our friend insists that Stormer must become Prime Minister. Nicholas, exhausted and overwhelmed at the front, usually complied. It was easier than arguing with his wife, and he'd come to rely on Rasputin's supposed spiritual insight. The result was governmental chaos. In the 2 years between 1915 and 1917, Russia went through 4 prime ministers, 4 ministers of war, 6 ministers of the interior, 4 ministers of agriculture, 3 foreign ministers. The constant turnover made coherent policy impossible. Competent ministers were dismissed because Rasputin didn't like them or because they refused to pay him bribes. Incompetent ministers were appointed because they flattered Rasputin or paid him off. The most notorious example was Alexander Protopopov, whom Rasputin championed for Minister of Interior. Protopopov was a mediocrity at best. possibly suffering from syphilis that was affecting his mind. He was also convinced he could communicate with the ghost of the previous Tsar. In other words, he was insane. But he had Rasputin's support, so he got the job. One observer wrote, "We are being governed by a drunken peasant, a hysterical German woman, and a lunatic who believes he's channeling the dead." It was hard to argue with that assessment. As Rasputin's political influence grew, so did the line of petitioners seeking his favor. Businessmen who wanted government contracts, nobles seeking court positions, generals wanting promotions. Anyone who needed something from the government knew that the path ran through Rasputin. And Rasputin, for all his spiritual pretensions, was happy to be bribed. Envelopes full of cash appeared in his apartment, jewels, expensive gifts. His followers would pay his massive restaurant bills, his bar tabs, his expenses at the gypsies' clubs where he spent many drunken nights. He was becoming wealthy. Not extravagantly so. He still lived in the same modest apartment, still wore peasant clothes, but comfortable in ways he'd never been before. The corruption was blatant. Police reports document him accepting money, making promises, then getting on the phone to Alexandra to recommend appointments. One report, subject received 3,000 rubles from petitioner seeking to avoid military service. Subject immediately telephoned the palace. Another, subject dining at the Villa Road, intoxicated, boasted openly that he could make or break any official in Russia, accepted payment from multiple petitioners, promising intervention. This wasn't politics in the normal sense. It was a bizarre form of feudal patronage, except the patron was a peasant mystic with no official position, no legal authority, and no understanding of what he was doing, and the entire country knew about it. By 1916, St. Petersburg, Petrograd, was awash in rumors about Rasputin. Some true, most exaggerated, all contributing to a growing sense that the government was controlled by dark forces. The most damaging rumor was that Rasputin and Alexandra were lovers. There's no credible evidence this was true. Alexandra was rigidly moral, deeply religious, and genuinely devoted to Nicholas. She seems to have viewed Rasputin as a holy man and nothing more. But the optics were terrible. She spent hours alone with him. She kissed his hand. She called him father and our friend with an intimacy that seemed inappropriate. Her letters to Nicholas about Rasputin were full of passionate language. "Our friend loves you so much. Our friend believes in you completely. I long for our friend's guidance." To a population that already distrusted her because of her German origins, these letters, which were leaked and published, looked like evidence of an affair. Worse, they suggested Rasputin was a German spy. Why else would this peasant have so much power? Why else would he supposedly oppose the war? He must be working for the Kaiser, using the besotted Empress to sabotage Russia from within. This was nonsense. Rasputin opposed the war because he genuinely foresaw disaster, not because of German sympathies. But the rumor was too juicy to kill. Pornographic cartoons circulated showing Rasputin and Alexandra in bed together, sometimes with Nicholas watching helplessly. Poetry mocking the royal family appeared on walls. Jokes spread through every level of society. How is Russia governed? A German woman spreads her legs for a drunken peasant, and he whispers orders that the Tsar obeys. For an autocracy that depended on public reverence for the monarchy, this was fatal. The dynasty was being turned into a joke, and the joke's punchline was Rasputin. On November 19th, 1916, a liberal politician named Pavel Milyukov gave a speech in the Duma, the Russian parliament, that changed everything. He catalogued the government's incompetence, the military disasters, the corruption, the bizarre ministerial appointments, and he repeated after each item, "Is this stupidity or is this treason?" The implication was clear. Either the government was hopelessly incompetent, or they were deliberately sabotaging Russia, and behind it all was Rasputin. 5 days later, an ultra-conservative politician named Vladimir Purishkevich gave an even more inflammatory speech. He declared that Russia was being ruled by dark forces, that an evil peasant had corrupted the Empress and was destroying the nation, that Rasputin was a devil who had to be stopped. "It is impossible to govern Russia while that drunk peasant operates the government from his apartment," Purishkevich shouted. "The Tsar must be saved from this evil influence. Russia must be saved." The Duma erupted in applause. Even the usually servile representatives were fed up. After the speech, a young aristocrat named Felix Yusupov approached Purishkevich. "I agree with everything you said," Yusupov told him, "and I think we should do something about it. Are you interested?" Purishkevich understood immediately what Yusupov was suggesting. "Yes," he said, "I am very interested." The conspiracy to murder Rasputin had begun. In the final weeks of his life, Rasputin's behavior became even more erratic. He drank constantly, was seen stumbling through the streets at all hours, ranting about demons, about death, about the end of everything he told friends. "I won't see the new year, they're going to kill me." And in mid-December, he sat down and wrote a letter, a prophecy, his final prophecy. He addressed it to Nicholas and Alexandra, and it was found after his death. "I write this letter in St. Petersburg. I feel that I shall leave life before January 1st. I wish to make known to the Russian people, to Papa, to Mama, and to the children what they must understand. If I am killed by common assassins, and especially by my brothers the Russian peasants, you, Tsar of Russia, have nothing to fear for your children. They will reign for hundreds of years in Russia. But if I am murdered by nobles, if they shed my blood, their hands will remain soiled with my blood for 25 years. They will leave Russia. Brothers will kill brothers, and in 25 years, there will not be a single noble left in Russia. Tsar of the Russian land, if you hear the bell that tells you Grigori has been killed, you must know this. If it was your relations who have wrought my death, then no one in your family, that is to say, none of your children or relations, will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. I go, and I feel in me the divine command to tell the Russian Tsar how he must live after I have disappeared. You must reflect and act prudently. Think of your safety and tell your relations that I have paid for them with my blood. I shall be killed. I am no longer among the living. Pray, pray, be strong. Think of your blessed family." He signed it, sealed it, and gave it to Alexandra. Then he waited for death. Prince Felix Yusupov was one of the richest men in Russia. His family owned estates, palaces, mines, and oil fields. He was 29 years old, strikingly handsome and openly bisexual, scandalous even in the permissive aristocratic society of the time. He was also convinced that Rasputin was destroying Russia, that the dynasty could only be saved if the mad monk was eliminated. His partner in the conspiracy was Vladimir Purishkevich, the ultra-conservative politician whose speech had electrified the Duma. At 57, Purishkevich was a Russian nationalist, a monarchist, and a violent anti-Semite. He loved the Tsar, but hated what he saw as the alien influences corrupting the throne: Germans, Jews, and most of all, the peasant charlatan who'd bewitched the Empress. The third conspirator was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to the Tsar himself. At 25, Dmitry was torn. He loved Nicholas, but he also saw that Rasputin's influence was poisoning the government. He agreed to join the plot, though he would later claim he participated only reluctantly. They recruited 2 others, an army physician named Stanislaus Lazarevert to supply poison, and a junior officer named Ivan Sukotin to help with logistics. Together, they began planning the murder. Yusupov had a connection to Rasputin. They'd met at several society gatherings, and Rasputin had been drawn to the handsome young prince. There were rumors they'd had a sexual relationship, though Yusupov denied this. What's certain is that Rasputin trusted Yusupov enough to accept an invitation to his palace late at night. The bait was Yusupov's wife, Princess Irina. She was one of the most beautiful women in Russia, niece to the Tsar, celebrated for her looks. Rasputin had mentioned several times that he'd like to meet her. Yusupov told Rasputin that Irina was feeling unwell and wanted the holy man to pray over her. But she couldn't be seen publicly with Rasputin. The scandal would be too great. So could he come to the palace late at night, discreetly, to perform a healing. Rasputin agreed. Probably he suspected nothing. Possibly he knew it was a trap, but went anyway. His prophecy letter suggests he'd accepted that death was coming. The conspirators prepared the Moika Palace basement carefully. They set up a dining room, arranged furniture to make it look lived in, set out cakes and wine. And then Dr. Lazarevert added the poison. He'd procured potassium cyanide, a deadly poison that kills quickly by preventing cells from using oxygen. A lethal dose is about 250 milligrams. Lazarevert had several grams. He ground the cyanide crystals into powder and mixed them into cream-filled cakes. He poured liquid cyanide into wine glasses. There was enough poison in that room to kill dozens of people. Then they waited for Rasputin to arrive. Just before midnight on December the 29th, 1916, Yusupov's car pulled up outside Rasputin's apartment. Rasputin emerged wearing his best clothes: a silk peasant blouse, velvet trousers, expensive boots. His hair and beard were carefully combed. He dressed up for the meeting with Princess Irina. He climbed into the car, and they drove through the snowy streets to the Moika Palace. Yusupov led Rasputin down to the basement room, told him that Irina was still upstairs with guests, but would come down soon. In the meantime, would he like some refreshments? Rasputin sat down at the table, looked around the room. His eyes lingered on the cakes. "Are you hungry, Grigori?" Yusupov asked. "A little. Please, help yourself." Upstairs, the other conspirators listened, waiting for sounds of Rasputin dying. Rasputin ate 2 of the poisoned cakes, drank 2 glasses of poisoned wine. Yusupov watched, growing more nervous by the minute. The cyanide should have worked almost immediately. Rasputin should have convulsed, turned blue, collapsed. Instead, he sat there, chatting pleasantly, asking when Irina would arrive, commenting on the wine. 15 minutes passed. Half an hour. An hour. Rasputin showed no symptoms at all. Yusupov excused himself and ran upstairs to the other conspirators. "He's not dying! He ate the cakes! He drank the wine! And nothing's happening!" Purishkevich couldn't believe it. Impossible. There's enough poison in those cakes to kill a horse. But Rasputin was still alive, still conscious, still waiting patiently for the princess who wasn't coming. The conspirators panicked. What were they supposed to do now? The poison was supposed to be foolproof. They hadn't planned beyond this point. Finally, Dmitri gave Yusupov a revolver. "You have to shoot him," Dmitri said. Yusupov took the gun. His hands shaking, he returned to the basement. When Yusupov re-entered the room, Rasputin looked up, smiling. "Is Irina ready to see me?" "Soon," Yusupov lied. "But first, I want to show you something. This crucifix. It belonged to my grandmother. Very valuable." He gestured to a cabinet across the room. Rasputin stood and walked over to examine it, and Yusupov raised the revolver and shot him in the back. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Rasputin screamed and fell, clutching his side. Blood spread across the silk of his shirt. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. Then he went still. Yusupov ran upstairs. "He's dead! I shot him, and he's dead!" The conspirators came down to see the body. Dr. Lazavet checked for a pulse, found none. They stood around the corpse, relief washing over them. It was done. The nightmare was over. They began discussing how to dispose of the body. They'd planned to throw it in the Neva River, but they needed to wait for the city to quiet down first, and they needed to clean up the crime scene. Yusupov volunteered to stay with the body while the others went upstairs to figure out the details. He stood there, looking down at Rasputin's corpse, and then the corpse's eye opened. Yusupov would later describe this moment as the most terrifying experience of his life. Rasputin's left eye opened and fixed on him. Then the other eye, both eyes, filled with hatred, staring directly at Yusupov. Then Rasputin moved. Not a death twitch, not a convulsion. He deliberately pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, bleeding heavily but clearly alive. "Felix," Rasputin said, his voice a wet gurgle. "Felix, you'll never forget this moment." Yusupov screamed and ran for the stairs. Behind him, Rasputin lurched to his feet, stumbled toward the stairs, started climbing. By the time Yusupov reached the top, Rasputin was halfway up, dragging himself forward, leaving a trail of blood, roaring incoherently. The other conspirators heard the screaming and came running. They saw Rasputin emerge from the basement stairs, covered in blood, his eyes wild, death seemingly impossible for him. Purishkevich raised his own revolver and fired, missed. Rasputin turned and ran across the courtyard toward the palace gates, trying to escape, trying to reach the street where he could scream for help. Purishkevich chased after him, firing wildly. His second shot hit Rasputin in the back. The mad monk stumbled but kept moving. Third shot hit him in the shoulder. Rasputin fell to his knees, but started crawling. Fourth shot hit him in the head. Finally, Rasputin collapsed face first in the snow. The conspirators ran over. Rasputin was twitching, groaning, his fingers clawing at the ground. Yusupov, in a state of complete hysteria, grabbed a metal dumbbell-like object and began beating Rasputin's head with it again and again, screaming about demons, about the devil, about how he wouldn't stay dead. Finally, Purishkevich pulled Yusupov away. "He's dead," Purishkevich said. "He has to be dead." They stood there, breathing hard, staring at the body. Rasputin didn't move again. It was nearly 3 a.m. They needed to get rid of the body before sunrise. They wrapped Rasputin in a blue curtain, bound it with rope, and carried him to Purishkevich's car, drove through the silent, snowy streets to the Bolshoi Petrovsky Bridge. There they carried him to the side of the bridge, where the river wasn't completely frozen. found a hole in the ice where the current was strong enough to drag a body downstream. As they prepared to throw him in, one of the conspirators noticed something. His hand is moving. They all looked. The fingers of Rasputin's right hand were flexing slowly, as if trying to grab something. "He's still alive," someone whispered. They panicked and simply threw him into the water, curtain and all. Rasputin sank into the black water and disappeared. The conspirators fled, went back to the palace, spent hours cleaning blood, burning evidence, inventing alibis. By dawn, they were convinced they'd gotten away with it. But they'd made a mistake. Rasputin had lost a boot in the courtyard, and someone found it the next morning. Blood on the snow. Blood on the bridge. Within hours, police were investigating. 2 days later, on December the 31st, 1916, a police officer walking along the Petrovsky Bridge noticed something caught against the ice pillars below. They sent men down with ropes. It was Rasputin's body, frozen solid, arms raised above his head, as if he'd been reaching for the surface when death finally took him. They performed an autopsy, found water in his lungs, which meant that despite being poisoned, shot 4 times, beaten with a metal object, and having his skull fractured, Grigori Rasputin was still alive when he went into the water. He drowned, slowly, in the darkness beneath the ice, trying desperately to break free, to reach the surface, to survive even this. The man was almost impossible to kill. The Tsar learned of Rasputin's death while at the front. He returned immediately to Petrograd. The conspirators expected arrest, trial, execution. Instead, Nicholas did nothing. He couldn't punish members of his own family and prominent politicians without causing a scandal that would make things even worse. Yusupov was sent into internal exile. Dmitri was sent to the Persian front, which probably saved his life, as he'd be out of the country when the revolution came. Purishkovich remained free. Alexandra was devastated. She insisted Rasputin be given a full funeral and burial, but the people of Petrograd celebrated. They sang in the streets. The dark force was dead. The demon was gone. Russia could finally be saved. They were wrong. Rasputin had written in his prophecy letter, "If I am murdered by nobles, then no one in your family will remain alive for more than 2 years." He was off by 3 months. On July 17th, 1918, exactly 19 months after Rasputin's death, Bolshevik revolutionaries led Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children into a basement in Ekaterinburg and shot them all. Alexei died first, his hemophilia making him bleed out faster than the others. The disease that Rasputin had kept at bay finally claimed him. The bodies were dissolved in acid and thrown down a mine shaft. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 300 years, was extinct, exactly as Rasputin had prophesied. The final irony of Rasputin's death is that his murder accomplished nothing. The conspirators believed that by killing the mad monk, they would restore sanity to the government, save the monarchy, and prevent revolution. Instead, they removed the one person who might have convinced Nicholas to make reforms. Rasputin, for all his flaws, understood the mood of the peasants. He'd warned that the war would destroy Russia. He told Nicholas that the people were starving, that the soldiers were mutinous, that disaster was coming. With Rasputin dead, Alexandra had no one to turn to. She became even more isolated, even more paranoid, even more convinced that the aristocracy was plotting against her. Nicholas, never a strong leader, became paralyzed with indecision. And 2 months after Rasputin's death, revolution swept through Russia like fire. The February Revolution of 1917 forced Nicholas to abdicate. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. Civil war erupted. Millions died. Everything Rasputin had prophesied came true. The legacy. So what was Rasputin, really? A holy man touched by God. A charlatan who manipulated desperate people. A psychologically damaged man caught between genuine mystical experiences and severe mental illness. The evidence suggests he was all of these at once. His healing abilities seem to have been real, however they worked. Too many reliable witnesses, including doctors and skeptics, confirmed that he could stop Alexei's bleeding when no one else could. Whether this was hypnosis, the placebo effect, simply keeping harmful aspirin away from the boy, or something genuinely supernatural, we'll never know for certain. His prophecies were eerily accurate. He foresaw World War I's catastrophic impact on Russia. He predicted the exact timeline of the Romanovs' destruction. He knew, somehow, that his death would seal their fate. But he was also a sexual predator who used religious language to justify assault. A drunk who could barely control his own impulses. A man so psychologically fractured that he'd argue with demons in the street. The tragedy is that if he'd simply been a mystic healer, he might have done real good, but he was elevated far beyond his abilities. Given political power, he had no capacity to wield responsibly, and protected from consequences by an empress who mistook healing power for wisdom, and Russia paid the price. But maybe the most disturbing aspect of Rasputin's story isn't about him at all. It's about the people who empowered him. An empire of 130 million people, one of the great powers of Europe, with a 1,000-year history of civilization. And it was brought down in part because an emperor and empress couldn't let go of a mystic who promised to keep their son alive. That's the real horror. Not that Rasputin was powerful, but that he was allowed to be powerful. That the mechanisms of government, of checks and balances, of rational policy-making could be short-circuited by one woman's desperate need to save her child. Alexandra never wavered in her faith in Rasputin. Even after his death, even after the revolution, even as she and her family were imprisoned by the Bolsheviks, she maintained that he'd been a holy man sent by God. Her last diary entry, written just days before her execution, mentions him. "I pray for our dear Grigori. He tried to save us. We should have listened." Maybe that's the saddest part of all. She never understood that Rasputin, intentionally or not, had helped destroy everything he claimed to protect. There's one final grotesque footnote to Rasputin's story. After his burial, as revolution engulfed Russia, a mob broke into the chapel where he was interred. They dragged his coffin out, pried it open, and decided to burn the body. According to witnesses, as the flames consumed Rasputin's corpse, it sat up. Of course, this was just the muscles contracting from the heat, a common occurrence in cremation, a natural, explicable phenomenon. But to the superstitious peasants watching, it looked like the mad monk was rising from the dead one more time. They fled in terror, leaving the body to burn. And perhaps that's the most fitting image. Rasputin's corpse, seeming to defy death even in flames, while Russia burned around him, the frozen prophet who wouldn't die, the healer who couldn't save himself, the holy devil who brought down an empire. His body turned to ash in 1917, but his ghost haunts Russia still. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest and strangest stories. If you found value in this deep dive, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue exploring the shadows of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I'm always fascinated to know who's joining us in the darkness. This has been the story of Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk who became a prophet, the peasant who toppled an empire, the man who saw the future and couldn't stop it. Till next time, this has been the Midnight Archives.